This is as true of those who seek answers to the question in religion as it is of those who seek it in tradition, culture, pure reason, or feeling. All these sources provide answers that need interpretation, especially in the light of changed circumstances. Where does the Bible or Quran mention genetic cloning? And the answers are open to criticism, reflection, and dispute both within religions or cultures, both within religions or cultures and beyond them. Those who believe that ethics is somehow empty without religion, especially revealed religion, owe us an explanation of how people like Aristotle and Mencius could produce such profound ethical discussions with such minimal reference to religion. In fact, the natural law tradition of the Catholic Church recognizes the fact that much of ethics can be addressed independently of religious revelation. I do not want to say that religion has no significance for ethics, but those connections that exist are much more nuanced than is commonly supposed. We should allow religion a voice at the table of ethical discussion, but no decisive veto on how the discussion proceeds. Much the same applies to culture. There can be no doubt that culture, in one sense or another, is a source of ethical belief, but the ready-made outlooks on ethics provided by one's local traditions or by one's parents did not simply settle the matter of how one should live. There is a significant distinction between source and justification. In whatever culture one finds oneself, the answers to the basic ethical question must take account of empirical qualities, new possibilities, and answers provided by other cultures and by innovative individuals, of consistency, and of the connection of prevailing local values with the fundamental needs of human nature. The simple cultural relativist thinks that what is right or wrong can be a matter only of what is parochially approved or disapproved. Let's try that again. The simple cultural relativist thinks that what is right or wrong can be a matter only of what is parochially approved or disapproved. And since parishes vary, so inevitably does ethics. But this isolates culture unrealistically from outside influences, absurdly simplifies inner dynamics, ignores the role of reasoning in ethics, and that always reaches to the universal thought. It begins with the local. The fuck, man. But this isolates culture unrealistically from outside influences, absurdly simplifies its inner dynamics, ignores the role of reasoning in ethics that always reaches to the universal, though it begins with the local, and denies the plain fact that we are all members of one species. Some of the follies of cultural relativism are fueled by the desire to be tolerant, but tolerance is itself a virtue that needs to be recommended on grounds other than cultural preference. After all, most cultures have endorsed various forms of extreme intolerance rather than mutual respect. It is true and very relevant to our topic that perfectly universal values can take varied cultural forms in different places, and that some values have a purely local or religious provenance. Other moral views may well eventually prove to be universal in reach, but are presently legitimately contentious. Moral progress is in part consists of gaining greater certainty and acceptance about views that were initially controversial. Witness the development of understanding about the equality of women. I do not mean to deny that there are false and strident universalisms that fail to take account of morally relevant differences in the circumstances of individuals and groups. Indeed, this is relevant to some of the problems of intervention, as we shall see. Nonetheless, the need to take account of those variations is itself a universal ethical demand. Moral thinking is not easy. and deep moral disagreements about complex issues are to be expected, but attempts to understand and, when possible, resolve these disagreements are demanded by both reason and mutual respect. Finally, a word about moral theory. The relevance of philosophical theories of morality to actual moral argument and debate is often remote. Whatever their speculative disagreements, theorists readily reach a degree of consensus about what moral reasons are relevant and even decisive in practical matters. One area, however, where theoretical commitments can make a practical difference is utilitarian thinking. For the utilitarian, it is ultimately only some version of the greatest happiness, of the greatest number, that matters. Utilitarian calculations about what actions will maximize the best outcomes for sentient beings can conflict with duties and prohibitions that are not so based. One may, for instance, be obliged to refrain from murder or torture, even when the consequences of doing so can be expected to produce dire results. So many believe that terrorist attacks on the innocent are wrong even when the terrorists have a just cause and can advance it significantly by the attacks. By contrast, utilitarian calculations might nonetheless show that some terrorism is right because it produces the best outcomes overall. Divergences about the morality of the terror bombings of cities in World War II turn in part on this difference of theoretical approach. Realist cautions. The various schools of realism so fashionable in the United States over the past 70 years or so have appeared to deny the importance of ethics in international affairs. But the best of these theorists have in practice exhibited a distinctly conscious concern for the use of power in foreign relations. This can appear paradoxical, but their various strictures against morality are better seen as objections to a distorted and inappropriate understanding of morality, and hence an improper use of it in foreign affairs. In my view, the realists can most sensibly be regarded, in spite of many of their own formulations, as objecting to moralism rather than morality. In doing so, unfortunately, they have sometimes given an absurdly exalted respect to a narrow idea of national interest as the moral fulcrum for discussion of foreign policies, the difficulties in which we have discussed earlier. They've also tended to exaggerate the difference that power makes to moral principle. Nonetheless, they have stressed important aspects of any sane deployment of morality in the international affairs. Three of the most significant complaints about moralism in connection with our present topic are the following. The dangers of moral self-inflation, whereby you instinctively adopt a stance of moral superiority over other nations and thereby become insensitive to the flaws in your own. This is evident in the McKinley statement with which we began, but might be matched by numerous others from various world leaders. Under the influence of this distortion, the genuine moral and political evils that exist in the world tend to become focused exclusively in certain regions, on even persons, and a primitive good guys, bad guys grid excludes the complex subtleties that moral and political judgment often require. Sanctification of oneself goes hand in hand with demonization of the other, and such rigid dualism is an obstacle to a sober ethic of international responsibility. There are very bad policies and very bad political leaders, but realism dictates that we recognize the presence of evil wherever and whenever it occurs. It also dictates that we take cognizance of the fact that the monsters of today, were our allies of yesterday, and may be our allies of tomorrow, and that our own shining virtue often appears in a different light to others. Demonization can profoundly distort perceptions and actions in the context of intervention. The dangers of moral oversimplification, whereby the only issues involved in a conflict are seen as human rights violations and other serious acts of oppression. They are always significant and may indeed be sometimes the overwhelming consideration, but a concern for them can blinker our understandings of the history and the context in which they occur. Even if we are not confused by a distorted sense of our own moral superiority, we may nonetheless fail to grasp the background to present atrocities or persecutions, and this grasp may be crucial to effective remedial action. Outrage is no substitute for insight. A legitimate concern for principles needs to be anchored in the factual realities within which the principles have to make sense and be applied. The illicit imposition of values on others. Sometimes this is a problem of the imposition of values that are legitimate elsewhere but inappropriate to these different circumstances. It is a crucial maxim of ethics that circumstances alter cases. The total separation of church and state, and the freedom of artistic expression certainly embody important values, but these values may have to be negotiated carefully and introduced cautiously by locals in certain cultural contexts, where their promotion by foreigners could be disastrous. And other values, like the right to relatively unrestricted private ownership of guns, if a value at all, have little claim to universality. The realist caution particularly addresses the need to keep these three risks in mind when facing the question of using military might for altruistic purposes. Humanitarian violence. A paradox? The question of morality of intervention, the question of the morality of the question of the morality of intervention is part of the broader question of the morality of war, since I treat intervention as an act of war, whether war is declared or not. It therefore inherits much of what is morally problematic about war and other uses of political violence. Brian Hare apparently disagrees, since he wants to distinguish sharply between war and intervention, treating the morality of war as governed by the anti-aggression paradigm, whereas intervention is not. I'm not impressed by this proposal, but it is not clear how much turns on it. Hare, in fact, thinks that in many ways the character of intervention makes it more difficult to justify than war, and he treats the task of moral justification as essentially provided by the framework of just war thinking with suitable adaptation. One reason for not sharply distinguishing the two is that intervention frequently has all or most of the behavioral features of war, as in the intervention against Serbia over Kosovo or the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia. He may be influenced by the feeling, shared by many enthusiasts for humanitarian intervention, that it is really a form of policing rather than war. Sometimes that may be plausible, as in very low level actions such as the bloodless French intervention with 1,800 troops to help overthrow the dictator Bokassa in the Central African Republic in 1979. But as things usually stand, interventions require warriors rather than police, though police may be useful, if hard to come by, after an intervention. A further linguistic question is raised by the tendency to restrict the term violence or political violence to the activity of illegitimate agents, who then turn out to be non-state actors. More recent U.S. discourse lumps rogue states with non-state actors. States, or at least non-rogues, use force rather than violence, even when the effects and performances are otherwise identical. This reminds me of that linguistic habit whereby I and my friends are invariably firm and resolute, whereas you and your associates are stubborn and pig-headed. Given the appalling record of states in the unjustified employment of lethal force to devastate populations, economies, and cultures over the centuries, I am unimpressed by this sort of attempt to put a conceptual or moral gulf between the resort to weaponry for political purposes by state agencies and its employment by non-state actors. So the air of paradox is connected with the morally problematic nature of resort to war, and this explains to a large degree the strong bias in international law and UN Charter against military intervention, which must be viewed in the light of the revulsion against the horrors associated with the great aggressive wars of the 20th century. The idea that one can initiate such horrors, or anything approximating them, hence wage aggressive war, for humanitarian purposes, must retain an air of paradox. Can an aggressive war be humanitarian? The just war tradition and defense against aggression. The just war tradition. The primary machinery for considering whether aggressive war can be humanitarian must at least begin with the just war tradition. This tradition has been criticized in various ways, but suitably understood, it provides a reasonable apparatus for tackling the questions of war and intervention. Indeed, if you're not a pacifist about war, then there is a minimal sense in which you have to be a just war theorist. That is, you have to give reasons why going to war can be justified and under what circumstances. No matter how common war has been as an instrument of state power and policy, the fact that it involves deliberate killing and maiming of human beings and great destruction of their property and of their natural and cultural environment means that resort to its demands the discharge of a heavy burden of justification. That resort to it demands the discharge of a heavy burden of justification. Furthermore, there are convincing reasons connected with the powerful concept of atrocity why your mode of justifying war will have to include considerations about what ways of conducting war are off limits morally. The former issues are often discussed under the rubric of what is called the just ad bellum, which may be translated as just grounds for going to war. And the latter, under the rubric of the jus in bello, just conduct in waging war. All this is largely dependent of the precise form of war, or form of just war theory will take. All this is largely dependent of the precise form a just war theory will take. And it also, incidentally, relatively independent of culture. The idea that a just war theory is merely Western or European is somewhat like the idea that the science of physics is merely Western or European. Both claims are rough approximations to the truth in terms of the origin of these explicit intellectual practices, but this says nothing of their validity or their relations to parallel theories from other cultures. In fact, a great deal of writing in the Chinese philosophical tradition addresses precisely the questions that a moral theory about the resort to war and the conduct of war must address. The writings of Mo Tzu and Sun Tzu are just two significant examples. The Moist text against offensive war contains a critique of warmongering that would be at home with classical just war writings in the Western traditions. Its flavor can be gathered from the following quotation: "If the rulers and officials and generals of the world sincerely desire to promote what is beneficial to the world and to eliminate what is harmful, they should realize that offensive war is in fact a great harm to the world." Sun Tzu, strictures against waging war against civilians are equally significant in connection with the jus in bello. As critics often point out, militarists and politicians have undoubtedly abused just war theory as a license for easy and destructive resort to war. As I understand it, however, and as it has been increasingly interpreted by philosophers, theologians, and lawyers in the 20th century, the ethic of the just war is restrictive. It insists not only on the justice of the cause for which war is conducted, but also on certain other restrictive conditions, chief among them which are the proportionality of resort to war for such cause, considering its effects out of proportion to the offense occasioning it, the requirement of last resort, which emphasizes the value that war breaks and cautions against too hasty a recourse to violence, the criterion of right intention, which orients the military action toward justice rather than revenge, bloodlust, or mere expansionism, the test of appropriate authority, which is aimed at keeping the resort to violence under the control that authority, at least in principle, can give it, the consideration of the realistic prospects for success, which basically attempt to rein in the passions of war by the desiderata of rationality and practical reasoning, and various moral criteria for the means used in waging war, such as non-combatant immunity. Many of these conditions might be justified in utilitarian terms alone, since it is plausible to think that the outcomes of observing them are likely to be optimal for all concerned. Others are more plausibly addressed from a non-utilitarian perspective, especially the requirement of non-combatant immunity. In broad terms, then, the just war tradition treats war as sometimes necessary evil rather than heroic romp, and in terms of just cause, the idea has been that war can only or principally be justified as a defensive measure against a defense against aggression. This has in modern times become the centerpiece of the jus ad bellum and the international law of war, which reflects the jus ad bellum to a large degree. One of the most instructive features of the debate about humanitarian intervention that emerged in the 1990s was its challenge to this paradigm. Grounding the paradigm. Before considering the challenge, however, we should briefly sketch the moral force of the idea of defense against aggression. The power of the defense against aggression model can be derived from the moral appeal of a simple model of legitimate self-defense. This goes roughly as follows. You are on your way home from work when you are set on by an attacker with an axe. In the ensuing struggle, you are surely entitled to defend yourself, and if you happen to have a gun in your pocket that you have, say, confiscated from a child at the school where you teach, then you are surely entitled to use it on the attacker if all else fails, even to lethal effect. This is one version of the domestic model from which much of the modern theory of the just war can be derived. There are indeed problems extrapolating from an individual's right of self-defense to that of a collective entity such as a nation, just as there are problems moving from a single pistol to an armory of nuclear weapons. But for the moment, we shall leave these aside. Crucial points. We shall leave these aside. The crucial point is simply to note the elemental power of the idea of self-defense in justifying what would otherwise be illicit, namely the violent killing of a human being. Challenging the paradigm, a case for intervention. The contemporary debate about intervention, when it is not simply an explicit or disguised debate about what great powers can get away with in pursuit of various geopolitical strategies, raises the question of whether legitimate aggressive wars can prevent or correct wrongs. In some respects, Brian Hare has pointed out, answering this question in the affirmative represents a return to a much earlier just war model that the current paradigm displaced. The reigning paradigm, it is true, had always recognized certain extensions of the anti-aggression model, such as wars to help others defend themselves against aggression, wars against a clear threat to world peace, and interventions in civil wars to balance prior unjust interventions. But these all had a recognizable, if sometimes stretched, connection with the defense against aggression. In recent years, the permissibility of interventions to prevent genocide within state boundaries has been suggested. And some have thought this could be as aiding or creating a defense against a sort of aggression. Now, however, we see increasing resort to arguments that advocate interventions to prevent egregious human rights abuses or other grave internal moral crimes. Stanley Hoffman, for example, lists the following two categories: threats to international peace. Primary candidates for this category are what Hoffman calls dangerous states, though failed states may pose danger in this way also. He cites the plight of the Kurds in northern Iraq, the overthrow of President Aristide by armed thugs in Haiti, and the collapse of law and order in Somalia. A massive violation of human rights. This would include, for Hoffman, the threat of genocide, as well as lesser though awful violations such as forced expulsions of populations and the sort of rampage killings that went on in Kosovo and East Timor. There's a question about the degree to which such proposals depart at all from the existing restrictions of international law. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter provides for military action in the case of threats to international peace. And there has been a movement among those eager to relieve suffering abroad and to bring humanitarian intervention under this heading. Hoffman is one who has such ambitions, and he sees support for this broadening interpretation in decisions of the United Nations and the Security Council. This is a much debated issue, and controversy about it was heightened during the intervention in Serbia on behalf of the Albanian Kosovars. Since our topic is ethics rather than law, I shall bypass this debate and merely record my view that it is more plausible to suppose that the UN provision really envisaged a response to international aggression rather than to acts of internal suppression. It is in any case unclear that the examples given by Hoffman under this heading do represent threats to international peace, since other nations can seem fundamentally unaffected by such horrors as the military overthrow of Aristide or the Iraqi persecution of Kurds. Where they are affected, it may be more a minor irritant than a major disturbance. And if these are really threats to international peace, then so are numerous other occurrences in different parts of the world, such as the military coups in Pakistan and the Ivory Coast in recent years. The same points will apply to attempts to bring massive violations of human rights under the current rubrics of international law. More important than the legality question, from the ethical point of view, is the question of whether the prominence given to defense against aggression, on which much legal regulation rests, needs radical revision in light of the problems created by tyrannical regimes or by failed or profoundly unstable states. There is a powerful moral intuition at work in the thinking of those who advocate interventions that apparently go beyond current international law and depart from the self-defense model. It is the intuition captured by the word rescue. Humanitarian interventions are seen as attempts to rescue the innocent and helpless from the persecutions and extreme distress. This is explicitly indicated by the rise of the phrase, the politics of rescue, most notably used by Walzer, who was himself a somewhat reluctant convert to the cause of interventionism. We can dramatize its appeal by resort to a simple analogy. You are once more on your way home from work, and you see a very strong man involved in an argument with his own child. It is noisy and unpleasant, but you reason it's their family and none of your business, so you continue on your way. But as you pass by, the dispute rapidly heats up, and the man begins beating the child with a heavy stick. You go so far as to protest and remonstrate the man, but he tells you in no uncertain terms to get lost. He continues beating the child viciously, and indeed draws a knife and begins to brandish it at him. You fear for the child's life, but you still have your confiscated gun. Surely, you should threaten the bully, and if the threats do not work, you are entitled to shoot. Similar considerations apply. The argument goes at the level of states, where the amount of power exercised repressively and even murderously is so much greater. It is perhaps significant in this connection to note that the strong objections to offensive war made by Motsu fall short of condemning the initiation of altruistic wars. And indeed he favors some righteous wars of punishment. This is also allowed to some degree by the 16th century European just war theorists, such as Vittoria and Suarez. And there is no denying the power of this institution, and the images of death and displacement from Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, East Timor, and Kosovo reinforce it. The sovereignty debate and the theory of aggression. It is often argued that the opposition to military intervention or war for any purpose other than defense against aggression or causes closely related to it is based on the modern concept of sovereignty arising from the Peace of Westphalia, which put an end to the European wars of religion. Simplifying somewhat, we may say that the concept limited states intervening militarily in matters that were the concern of other sovereign states, and gave the sovereign states themselves the right to govern and decide on the use of force internally for control and externally for defense. This constituted the recognition of a form of absolute sovereignty, and it seemed required by the need to establish a peaceful stability. It is then argued that the concept is dangerously outmoded, since the idea of sovereign power has been eroded by the economic and informational processes known as globalization, and by the development of cosmopolitan political processes associated with bodies such as the United Nations and the various global NGOs. Moreover, the concept was always flawed insofar as it left citizens at the mercy of their governments, with frequently alarming consequences. The non-state must now be regarded, therefore, as having conditional sovereignty. That is, sovereignty that is conditional on some minimal level of discharge of obligations to respect the rights or the human rights of its citizens. The critique and rejection of aggressive resort to war needs to be viewed against this background and therefore amended appropriately. There is undoubtedly something in this line of critique. The modern nation state and its pretensions are by no means sacrosanct. Nonetheless, the reigning paradigm is not so easily dismissed. The opposition to intervention, even for the purposes of doing good, is based on deeper insights than the needs of a 7th century political settlement, even though these insights had relevance to that settlement. There are two sorts of insight involved. The first concerns the need to limit the resort to war. This puts an emphasis on restricting the impulses to violent solutions to political problems, and does so by allowing such a resort only in the most palpable circumstances of justification, for example, self-defense. If you are actually under attack, you may be presumed to have a right, remember the simple domestic analogy, to the means needed to repel the attack, and much the same point seems to apply at the communal level. However, making the world safe for God, democracy, or free markets may be presumed to yield a much less secure right to unleash large-scale killing and maiming. This is especially so when we consider the ambiguities inherent in that trinity of concepts. The second concerns the right to national self-determination. Here, it is not Westphalia that is significant, but a combination of the much earlier insight that jurisdiction should have a strong local and popular element, which is not to be the same as democracy, and the much later developments associated with decolonization that gave prominence to the ethical political value of national self-determination. These insights are in danger of being forgotten by those who are enthusiastic for humanitarian intervention. Both insights are moral, though they have prudential components. The first needs no further explanation here except to note that the concern to limit war extends beyond the non-aggression paradigm to the other just war restraints such as proportionality of response, likelihood of achieving aims, respect for the immunities of non-combatants, and the complex and sometimes ambiguous requirement of last resort. The second insight needs some expansion under both elements of the combination. Colonialism got its bad name not merely from the explicitly exploitative and repressive policies of the colonial powers, grim as they commonly were, but also from the inherent difficulties foreigners face in understanding their subject peoples and properly comprehending their religions, cultural, and historical circumstances. Colonialism is also intrinsically committed to certain attitudes of inequality built into the idea of imperial rule and encapsulated in McKinley's patronizing remarks about Filipinos being unfit for self-government. The theme about unfitness is found even in so enlightened and profound a thinker as John Stuart Mill, whose famous essay on non-intervention made an exception to the prohibition on intervention for the case of uncivilized people. Mill is emphatic that it is a grave error to suppose that the same international customs and the same rules of international morality can obtain between one civilized nation and another, and between civilized nations and barbarians. It was a theme of the far less noble-minded Spanish conquistadors in South America, though. It was a theme of the far less noble-minded Spanish conquistadors in South America, though they linked it to the paganism of the Indian peoples that allegedly deprived them of rights to self-government. This proposition was decisively undermined by a number of courageous Spanish theologians, notably Vittoria, Las Casas, and Montesinos, who argued for a natural right of self-government possessed by peoples, whatever their religion. The American Indians, said Vittoria, undoubtedly possessed as true dominion, both public and private. The American Indians, said Vittoria, undoubtedly possessed as true dominion, both public and private, as any Christians. The self-government argument needs supplementation by some account of what constitutes people and what constitutes self-government. For the first, the idea of a nation, when couched in ethnic terms, is surely too narrow, and when couched in terms of state identity, it tends to beg the question. For the second, the requirement of democracy seems far too strong, though it indicates the ideal, and the absence of rebellion seems too weak. Mark Walter has made some effort to characterize the issue in terms of a certain kind of fit between a community and its government that disallows intervention even when the government is dictatorial and mistreating its subjects. Humanitarian intervention is then allowable only when the fit has radically broken down. Walter's position has its difficulties, and critics have not been lacking to point them out. David Lubin accused Walter of being immersed in the romance of the nation-state and argued for a commitment to self-defense, or argued for a commitment to a defense of basic human rights by violence if necessary when the targeted state lacked the consent of its population. Walzer's rhetoric is certainly somewhat romantic about the community and the state, but there is more to his position than the critics allowed, if only because the pragmatic realities tend to support it. Lubin has recently shifted ground on this, and from the other side, Walzer has also moved. The fact is that, at least for the time being, the system of relatively independent states seems likely to serve certain values such as peace, order, local pride, cultural integrity, somewhat better than various alternatives such as the revival of benign imperialism. The critique of sovereignty has some merit, but it surely suffers from the remarkable fact that enthusiasm for conditional or qualified sovereignty is often asymmetrical. Many of those who are keenest on the conditional sovereignty of others commonly resist strenuously the slightest diminution of their own sovereign rights.